I'm actually from Orange County, California. I grew up about a mile away from Disneyland. And grew up by the happiest place on earth, and had all my education down there in Orange County. Moved to LA, lived there as an adult, and then moved to Minnesota to go to law school at St. Thomas, and fell in love with the city and the community and stayed. So now I'm a Minnesotan. I focus on employment law. So I was previously an outsourced HR consultant, so I did that for 12 years. So I definitely got my feet wet doing that and knew that I wanted to work in the employment law arena once I became an attorney. So my focus there is on discrimination, sexual harassment, wrongful termination, and wage and hour issues. We don't have to go that far. We can think about Minneapolis with Andrea Jenkins and Philippe Cunningham. Two of the first, transgender individuals and trans people of color to be elected to office in the country. And to have two on one city council of a city so large was definitely historic from that perspective, especially given the fact that now with Minneapolis being really the focal point in regards to today's dialogue as it relates to race relations issues, especially as it deals with policing, and these being two influential members that are going to be involved in, reimagining what policing looks like, and having the rest of the country as well as the rest of the world looking at how it is we do it is just kind of amazing. And who would have thought, 5, 10, 20 years ago that this is where we would be, and these are two of the leaders that we have, not only LGBT leaders, but also, Black queer leaders, involved in this important dialogue and discussion that's going to impact so many. Queer is a very polarizing term for many people, especially since there's really a generational divide as it relates to the use of the term queer. So historically, queer has been a term that's been used to harm members of the LGBT community, and yet the younger generation has really reclaimed the term queer because they push back against the gender binary, thinking that you have to either be male or female. They want to just be able to be queer. They don't want to necessarily have to identify as being gay or lesbian. They want to be able to like what they like and who they like. And so the term queer is something that's still controversial, even within the LGBT community. So the advice that I would provide to folks that aren't members of the LGBT community is that if you end up having somebody that identifies as queer, or they use the term queer in a particular context, then you have permission to be able to use the term queer as well. But I would probably refrain against identifying somebody as queer if that's not how they personally identify, because there are definitely folks that are like, I'm a lesbian or I'm gay, but then there's folks that are very as adamant in regard to their identity as being queer. Again, it just shows the fluidity, and it's not as rigid of a term. It provides them to be able to self-identify in a way that is not necessarily conforming to societal norms. Well, the plus could include, there's lots. There's two, that sometimes you see the number two-spirit individuals. So those are folks from the Native American community. They don't identify under the LGBT umbrella from that perspective, because some of the tribes have hundreds of different genders. So it just depends on that perspective. You may see the I for intersex. Intersex would be folks whose gender characteristics don't correspond with the societal norms as it relates to gender, male or femaleness. The outdated term that would have been used in regard to this would have been somebody that was a hermaphrodite. That's an outdated term as it relates to that. So intersex is the one that deals with that currently, whether there's chromosomal or hormonal or bodily organs that are different from that perspective. You'll see the A sometimes, and you might see two A's. So the one A could be for asexual, right? And then there's for allies as well. Sometimes people include allies as it relates to that. But yeah, there's long acronyms. Sometimes the Q could be, historically was seen as questioning, so that could be for folks that are unclear in regard to their gender identity or their sexual orientation, and so there's space for them to be able to use time to figure that out. So sometimes you'll see two Qs, and one would be for queer, one would be for questioning. So it's the beauty of the language, always evolving. Yeah, so today's talk was in regards to the intersectionality between the LGBT movement and other social justice movements. And so the discussion was really on how woke are you? And so, the focus really was on the fact that you can be woke as it relates to, civil rights and black and brown for black and brown people, but you can be asleep as it relates to LGBT rights. You can be a feminist and all about women's lib and all those different types of things, but then you can also be asleep as it relates to trans women and excluding them from the feminist movement. So it was really looking at the different social justice movements and how they interact and intersect, and trying to broaden people's perspective from understanding that the term and the concept of being woke shouldn't just be something that's focused on a racial aspect, that there's many different ways where folks can be involved in social justice movements, and it's about that awakening to those different areas. It's funny that question kind of came up at the end of the session. So, the analogy that I would provide is, in regard to the concept of women wearing pants. So there was not that long in our country's history when women weren't allowed to wear pants. And, strangely enough, in the legal profession, there are certain judges that still require that women wear skirts or dresses in order to be acknowledged by the court. So there's still areas where we have some progress that needs to be made in regards to that. But really, it was, being able to wear pants, provided women with the ability to the autonomy to be able to wear number one, clothes I think that were maybe more comfortable for them, or that corresponded with their gender identity or gender expression, as well as some may have felt like there's power that came with the ability to be able to wear pants as opposed to this. And so again, there was a point in our country's history when that was an issue and a challenge for folks to be able to accept. And so, the transgender and gender nonconforming issue is just an evolution as it relates to people being able to identify how they want to identify, to be able to dress and express themselves in a way that corresponds with who it is that they are and makes them feel more comfortable and makes them feel alive and makes them feel like they're themselves. There's still a lot on the docket. So again, being an attorney in the employment law arena, was definitely happy as it relates to the most recent Supreme Court decision providing protections for individuals in the workplace that are LGBT across the country, as well as the marriage equality decision that came out 5 years ago. The problem is that you can get married, and there's still roughly over 30 states where you can get married on a Saturday and go to work, and before you could get fired once the employer found out that you were LGBT. That's not the case anymore, but you can still be kicked out of your home, right? For housing, there's no protections as it relates to housing discrimination. Being able to go into restaurants and the like, that there's public accommodations, that there's no protections there. As it relates to healthcare, that there can be discrimination and disparities provided as it relates to that, especially in regards to trans individuals. Because, trans folks, the care that trans folks need, whether it be hormone therapy or gender affirming surgeries, a lot of these procedures and treatments are available to other individuals that aren't LGBT, right? And so it's allowing for the medical professionals to decide what's medically necessary, and then for insurance companies to be held accountable to providing the same treatment to individuals that need it. The first question I would ask is, do you love them? And I'm sure the answer is going to be yes, whether that's your son, whether that's your grandson, whether that's your niece or your nephew or your godson. Do you love them? Because the thing is that they're no different. They're no different a person than you knew them the moment before they told you about their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And the challenge is to understand and recognize and realize that nobody would choose nobody would choose this for themselves if it would mean that you would risk losing the people that are most important to you, right? Who would ever voluntarily do something like that? It just doesn't make any sense. And so, the challenge would be to open their hearts and their minds in regards to having an honest and open dialogue with them in regards to, how long have they felt this way? Had they experienced any type of discrimination either at school or from family or friends? Have there been things that have been said in their place of worship that made them feel as though that they weren't welcome or weren't a whole human being? Those are dialogues and discussions I think that would help, broaden the perspective of individuals in regard to that. But I think the first question always comes back to whether they love them, because, it's scary to come out. And National Coming Out Day just passed, and I know a lot of people come out on that day. But at the end of the day, people just want to be loved, and especially loved by their family. And it's much more challenging for people to be successful in life if they don't have the support of their family. Do I see that us getting to a point where we have full inclusion across the board? And I would say that the answer for that would be yes. Each generation that goes on tends to be more accepting than the last. I was just speaking with one of the facilitators today, talking about that his son was in a wedding and there were two brides, and he was thinking, how am I going to explain this to him? And he just decided that he would he knew the couple already, and it was like they were already part of their family's life, and he just decided to not do anything and just let it go, and he was totally fine with it. It wasn't a big deal, and he was like, oh my God, everybody was so happy. We have to provide additional credit to the younger generations. My parents were raised during the time of segregation, and that wasn't my lived experience. And so I have a different, people would say progressive lived experience than what they had. And the younger generations are going to have a more progressive lived experience than I have. Some of them have lived through only having the access to the internet, where information was readily available to you, and a time where marriage equality was always here and always present, or that there were always I realized recently that I've been privileged to only live in a state where there were protections for LGBT folks. I've never lived in a state where there weren't protections for my community. And so I do think that as we move on in generations, come of age, that some of these things that we found to be taboo historically end up becoming part of the mainstream and part of the norm. Well, I hope that the takeaway would be the understanding that the LGBT community has always been here, and we've actually made some significant contributions to the country's history, and that's the important part about sharing more diverse history than what's currently being taught. If you look at the history books that are used currently in schools, you would think that straight white men did everything and nobody else did anything else. That women didn't make any significant contributions to our country. Black and brown folks never made any significant contributions to this country. Immigrants, people with disabilities, LGBT. And so, if we taught a more diverse history, highlighting folks, and it's not just in our history classes, even, providing, visibility in even a math class, right? There's two moms and they have a daughter and they go to I mean, there's there's easy ways to be able to do this, and that's actually part of the legislation that was passed in New Jersey in regard to the teaching of LGBT curriculum there. It's not focused on history, it's all throughout. That if we were to show a more diverse history, the acceptance of individuals that are different from others will be less challenging for people to acknowledge and accept.